Have you ever been told you are no longer welcome at your own family's most important celebration? If you have experienced something similar, please share your story in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family resilience and unexpected justice, I would really appreciate a like and subscribe. It means so much to have you here with me. My name is Dorothy, though everyone's always called me Dot, and I am 68 years old. What happened to me at my grandson's wedding reception last month has taught me that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones planning to hurt you the deepest. But it also taught me something else, that when you have lived as long as I have, and when you have survived as much as I have, underestimating you is the biggest mistake anyone can make. I raised my son Michael from the time he was 7, after my husband passed away from a sudden heart attack. Back then, single mothers didn't get the support they do now. I worked as a substitute teacher during the day and cleaned offices at night just to keep our little apartment and put food on the table. Michael was such a good boy. He would do his homework without being asked, help me fold laundry, and never complained when dinner was just soup and crackers again. When he graduated high school with honors and got a scholarship to the state university, I cried so hard during the ceremony that the lady next to me offered me her tissues. I was so proud. Michael did well for himself. He became an engineer, bought a house in one of those planned communities with the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. When he was 32, he met Vivian at some professional networking event. She was 28, worked in marketing for a luxury car dealership, and came from what she called Old Phoenix money. Her father owned several commercial properties around the valley, and her mother was involved in various charitable boards. Vivian was beautiful in that polished way, always perfectly dressed, never a hair out of place, the kind of woman who knew which fork to use at fancy restaurants. I tried to like her, I really did. When Michael first brought her around, she was polite enough, though she had this way of looking around my small apartment like she was cataloging everything that didn't meet her standards. She would smile and compliment my coffee, but then I would catch her checking her phone or glancing at her watch. When I offered to show her photo albums of Michael as a child, she said that was sweet, but they had dinner reservations. I told myself she was just nervous, that it takes time for people to warm up to each other. As their relationship progressed, I found myself gradually pushed to the margins of Michael's life. It started small, phone calls that became shorter and less frequent, holiday visits that got postponed or canceled, invitations to family gatherings that somehow got lost in the mail. When Michael proposed to Vivian after 8 months of dating, I heard about it through a Facebook post rather than a phone call. When I called to congratulate them, Michael apologized and said they would been so caught up in celebrating that he forgot to call. Vivian had planned a surprise announcement at her parents' country club, he explained, and they would gotten carried away with the excitement. The wedding planning was when the exclusion became obvious. I offered to help however I could. I wasn't wealthy, but I had time and energy, and I knew how to organize events from my years of coordinating school functions. Vivian thanked me politely and said they had everything under control. When I asked about being included in the bridal party activities, she explained that it was just going to be her sorority sisters and her cousins, people who had known each other for years. When I suggested hosting a small engagement party at the community center where I volunteered, she said they were trying to keep things simple and elegant. I should have paid more attention to the warning signs, but I was so focused on trying not to be the difficult mother-in-law that I ignored my instincts. At 68, I wasn't as sharp with technology as I used to be, and I relied on Michael to help me with things like online banking and insurance paperwork. My arthritis had gotten worse over the past few years, making it harder for me to drive at night or carry heavy groceries. I needed reading glasses for fine print, and sometimes I had trouble hearing in crowded restaurants. These weren't major disabilities, but they were enough to make me dependent on family for certain things, and I think Vivian saw that dependency as a weakness to exploit. The wedding was planned for a Saturday afternoon in late September at the Desert Botanical Garden, an expensive venue that Vivian's family had rented for the day. The guest list was over 200 people, mostly Vivian's family and their business associates, along with Michael's college friends and a few of his work colleagues. I was given a +1 invitation, like I was just another guest, not the groom's mother. When I asked Michael about special seating or whether there were any of the groom traditions I should know about, he said Vivian was handling all the details and that I shouldn't worry about anything except showing up and having a good time. I bought a new dress for the occasion, a lavender silk that wasn't too flashy but was nicer than anything I would worn in years. I had my hair done at a salon, got a manicure, and even splurged on new shoes that were comfortable enough for an elderly woman to stand in for several hours. I was excited, despite all the awkwardness, because this was my son's wedding day, and I was determined to be nothing but supportive and joyful. The morning of the wedding, I woke up early and spent extra time getting ready. I wanted to look my best, not just for the photos, but because I knew Vivian's family would be judging everything about Michael's side of the family. And I was essentially the only representative we had. I drove to the botanical garden carefully, giving myself plenty of time to find parking and get oriented. The venue was beautiful. Desert landscaping with flowering cacti and mountain views, white chairs arranged in perfect rows, and an arch covered in white roses and greenery. I found my assigned seat about halfway back on the groom's side, which felt appropriate. I wasn't expecting front row treatment, but I had assumed I would be close enough to see Michael's face clearly when Vivian walked down the aisle. The ceremony was lovely, though I noticed that when the minister asked about family blessings, only Vivian's parents stood up to speak. I waited for someone to mention me or invite me to say something, but that moment never came. I told myself it was fine, that not every wedding included those traditions. After the ceremony, cocktail hour began on a patio area surrounded by desert plants and sculpture. This was where I started to notice something was wrong. I approached Michael to congratulate him, and while he hugged me and thanked me for coming, his interaction felt rushed and forced. When I tried to talk to Vivian, she was suddenly surrounded by bridesmaids who seemed to form a protective barrier around her. Every time I moved toward their group, someone would intercept me with small talk or guide me toward the appetizer table. I began to feel like I was being managed rather than celebrated as family. When the photographer was taking family photos, I waited to be included, but the only shots I was invited into were large group pictures where I was positioned at the very edge. There were no intimate photos of me with Michael, no three-generation shots, no traditional mother and son moments that I had seen at other weddings. When I asked Michael about this, he said they were running behind schedule and would take more photos later. Later never came. The reception moved to an enclosed pavilion as the sun began to set. I found my assigned table toward the back of the room, seated with some of Michael's distant relatives and a few work colleagues I would never met. I wasn't at the family table, wasn't anywhere near the head table, wasn't even within easy conversation distance of my son. As dinner was served and toasts began, I felt increasingly isolated and confused. Why was I being treated like a stranger at my own son's wedding? That is when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I had gotten up to use the restroom, and as I was walking back toward my table, I passed a small alcove where Vivian's father was standing with someone I didn't recognize. Having what appeared to be a private business discussion, I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but as I passed by, I clearly heard Vivian's father say, as long as the old lady doesn't start asking questions about the finances, everything should proceed smoothly. The old lady, that had to be me. I was the only elderly woman on Michael's side of the family, and I was definitely the only one who might have any reason to ask questions about finances. But what finances? What was there to ask questions about? I hadn't been involved in any financial discussions related to the wedding or anything else. I stood there for a moment, pretending to admire a nearby sculpture while I tried to process what I would just heard. I thought back to some odd things I would noticed over the past few months. Michael had been vague about his work situation, mentioning something about a consulting contract, but never providing details. He would move to a more expensive apartment and was driving a newer car, but when I would ask about his promotion, he would change the subject. When I would needed his help with some paperwork related to my Social Security benefits, he would seem unusually interested in the details of my monthly income and assets. At the time, I would assumed he was just being helpful, but now I wondered if there was another motive. There was also the matter of the power of attorney documents he would ask me to sign a few months earlier. He would explain that they were just precautionary measures, so that if anything happened to me health-wise, he would be able to help manage my affairs. I would sign them because I trusted him completely, and because, at my age, it seemed like a responsible thing to do. But now I was wondering if those documents were being used for purposes I hadn't intended. I returned to my table, but I couldn't focus on the dinner, or the dancing, or the speeches. My mind was racing, trying to piece together whether I was being paranoid, or whether there was really something suspicious happening. After the cake cutting, I decided to leave early. I was tired, emotionally drained, and needed time to think about what I would heard. I found Michael to say goodbye, and when I hugged him, I whispered, "I love you, honey. I hope you will be happy." He hugged me back, but something in his expression looked almost guilty. I drove home slowly, my mind churning with questions and doubts. Once I was back in my apartment, I sat down with a cup of tea and tried to think through everything logically. What finances could Vivian's father have been referring to? What questions might I ask that would cause problems? I decided to start by reviewing my own financial situation to see if anything seemed out of place. I pulled out my monthly bank statements and started going through them line by line. Most everything looked normal. My Social Security deposits, automatic payments for utilities and insurance, occasional withdrawals for groceries and medication. But there were a few transactions I didn't remember making. Small amounts, $50 or $100 here and there, that had been transferred to an account I didn't recognize. The account numbers started with numbers that seemed familiar, but I couldn't place where I would seen them before. I also found some paperwork in my file cabinet that I didn't remember receiving. Documents related to investment accounts and retirement fund transfers, bearing my signature but dated during periods when I was sure I hadn't conducted any financial business. The signatures looked like mine, but something about them seemed slightly off. The pressure was different, or the pen strokes weren't quite right. I began to feel a chill of recognition that something was very wrong. The next morning, I called the customer service number for my bank and asked them to walk me through all the recent activity on my accounts. The representative was helpful and patient, explaining each transaction in detail. When we got to the transfers I didn't recognize, she told me they had been authorized through my online banking portal using the power of attorney credentials that had been registered on my account. Michael had used the legal authority I would given him to move my money around without my knowledge or consent. I hung up the phone feeling sick to my stomach. My own son, the boy I would sacrificed everything to raise and educate, was stealing from me. And not just stealing, he was using my trust and my age-related vulnerabilities against me. The power of attorney I would sign thinking it would protect me was actually being used to exploit me. I felt foolish, betrayed, and absolutely furious. But I also felt something else, a kind of cold, calculating anger that I hadn't experienced since my husband died, and I would had to fight the insurance company for his life insurance benefits. I might be 68 years old, I might need reading glasses and help with heavy lifting, but I was not a helpless victim. I had taught high school students for 30 years, and I knew how to research, how to document evidence, and how to fight for what was right. I spent the rest of that week gathering information. I printed out bank statements, made copies of all the suspicious documents, and created a timeline of when each questionable transaction had occurred. I also started paying attention to things I would previously overlooked. Michael's new apartment was in a complex that was far more expensive than anything his engineering salary should have been able to afford. His car was a luxury model that cost more than I would made in 2 years of teaching. His wedding had been elaborate and costly, with expenses that should have stretched even Vivian's family's resources. I also remembered something else that hadn't seemed important at the time. Several months earlier, I would received a phone call from someone claiming to be from a financial services company, asking me to verify some personal information for what they said was a routine security check. I would given them my Social Security number and other details, because they would seemed legitimate and had known enough about my accounts to convince me they were who they claimed to be. Now I wondered if that call had been part of setting up the unauthorized access to my finances. The more I learned, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about money. though the amounts involved were significant enough to impact my ability to maintain my independence and pay for future medical care. This was about respect, dignity, and family loyalty. Michael and Vivian had looked at me and seen nothing but a convenient source of funding for their lifestyle upgrade. They would count it on my trust, my limited understanding of modern banking technology, and my desire to avoid family conflict. They would bet that I would never catch on, and that even if I did, I wouldn't have the energy or knowledge to fight back. They were wrong on all counts. I might be elderly, but I wasn't stupid, and I certainly wasn't helpless. I had resources they didn't know about, including a sharp mind, a strong sense of justice, and absolutely nothing left to lose. If they wanted to treat me like an obstacle to their financial schemes, I was going to become their worst nightmare. I started by consulting with an attorney who specialized in elder financial abuse. The law office was recommended by a social worker at the senior center where I volunteered, and the lawyer, Patricia, was experienced in cases like mine. Her office was in a modern building downtown, and I remember feeling nervous as I sat in the waiting room surrounded by legal books and certificates. When Patricia finally called me back, she was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake who immediately put me at ease. When I showed her all the documentation I would gathered, she spent nearly an hour going through every page, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions or make notes in the margins. I watched her face change as she realized the scope of what I would uncovered. She nodded grimly and told me that what I was describing was unfortunately common, but that I had a strong case because I would been so thorough in documenting everything. She explained that many elderly victims either don't recognize the abuse or don't have the organizational skills to preserve evidence the way I had. Patricia walked me through similar cases she would handled, helping me understand that this wasn't a reflection of my intelligence or competence, but rather a sophisticated scheme designed to target people in exactly my position. She showed me examples of other power of attorney documents that had been misused, other fake business expenses that had been created to justify moving money around, and other families where adult children had systematically exploited their parents' trust and financial resources. Patricia explained that what Michael had done constituted several different crimes: elder financial abuse, identity theft, fraud, and possibly money laundering, if the amounts were large enough, or if the money had been moved through multiple accounts to hide its origins. She also told me that because Michael had used legal documents, like the power of attorney, to commit these crimes, the penalties would be more severe than if he would simply stolen my credit cards. We discussed my options. I could pursue civil remedies to try to recover the stolen money, file criminal complaints to have Michael prosecuted, or both. Patricia warned me that either path would likely destroy my relationship with Michael permanently, and that the legal process could be lengthy and emotionally draining. She asked me if I was prepared for those consequences. I told her I was. Michael had already destroyed our relationship when he chose to view me as a victim rather than his mother. The person who had stolen from me and lied to me wasn't the son I would raise. He was someone I didn't recognize, someone I couldn't trust, and someone I no longer wanted in my life. If he faced legal consequences for his choices, that was something he had brought on himself. Patricia and I developed a strategy. First, we would gather additional evidence by working with my bank to trace exactly where the stolen money had gone and whether it could be recovered. Second, we would file complaints with both the police and the State Adult Protective Services Division. Third, we would revoke the power of attorney documents immediately to prevent any further unauthorized transactions. Finally, we would prepare for the possibility that Michael and Vivian might try to retaliate against me or claim that I was mentally incompetent and had authorized the transactions myself. The investigation moved more quickly than I would expected. Within 2 weeks, Patricia's office had traced the money through several different accounts and discovered that the amounts were much larger than I would initially realized. Michael hadn't just been skimming small amounts from my checking account. He would been systematically draining my retirement savings, my emergency fund, and even the small investment account I would set aside for my eventual funeral expenses. In total, nearly $40,000 had been stolen over the course of 6 months. The forensic accountant that Patricia brought in was a detail-oriented woman named Rebecca, who specialized in following digital money trails. She showed me how modern banking systems leave electronic footprints that are almost impossible to erase completely. Every transaction, every transfer, every login attempt was recorded somewhere in the system. She spread out printed bank records across Patricia's conference table and used different colored highlighters to show me the pattern of how money had been moved from my accounts to various intermediary accounts and then finally to the real estate investments. Rebecca explained that the transfers had been carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems. Rather than moving large amounts at once, Michael had moved smaller sums over time, never quite reaching the thresholds that would have required additional verification or generated automatic alerts. It was a sophisticated approach that suggested he would either research these techniques extensively or had been coached by someone with experience in financial manipulation. The money trail led to some surprising discoveries. Michael and Vivian hadn't just been funding their personal lifestyle with my stolen money. They would been investing it in what appeared to be a real estate flipping scheme run by Vivian's father. The scheme involved buying distressed properties, making minimal improvements, and then selling them at inflated prices to buyers who were given questionable mortgages. It was the kind of operation that could generate huge profits in the short term, but was almost certainly illegal and unsustainable. What made the scheme particularly insidious was how it exploited multiple levels of trust and vulnerability. Elderly family members like me were convinced to sign over financial authority under the guise of family planning and protection. Young adults like Michael were recruited with promises of easy money and financial independence. Homebuyers were targeted with mortgage terms that seemed too good to be true, and they often were. The operation had tentacles reaching into different communities and different generations, all feeding money upward to Vivian's father and his business associates. When the police became involved, they discovered that I wasn't the only victim. Vivian's father had been running similar schemes involving several elderly relatives and family friends, using their children and grandchildren as intermediaries to gain access to their finances. Michael and Vivian were part of a larger network of financial abuse that had been operating for years, targeting vulnerable seniors whose families had convinced them to sign over financial control. The arrests happened on a Tuesday morning, about 6 weeks after the wedding. I was sitting in my kitchen having coffee and reading the newspaper when my phone rang. It was Patricia, calling to let me know that Michael, Vivian, and Vivian's father had all been taken into custody on charges related to elder financial abuse and real estate fraud. She told me that the district attorney's office was treating this as a major case because of the number of victims involved and the sophisticated nature of the scheme. I didn't feel victorious when I heard the news. I felt sad, exhausted, and oddly empty. This was my son we were talking about. The little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and who had once cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant. The man who had chosen greed over family loyalty was someone I barely recognized, but he was still the child I had loved and sacrificed for. The legal proceedings took months to unfold. Michael and Vivian both eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperating with the investigation into Vivian's father's larger operation. Michael was sentenced to 2 years in prison and 5 years of probation, during which he would be required to make restitution payments to all his victims. Vivian received a similar sentence. Her father, as the ringleader of the operation, was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. I recovered most of my stolen money, though the legal fees and the time value of the funds meant that I wasn't made completely whole. More importantly, I learned that I was stronger and more resourceful than I would given myself credit for. The experience of fighting back against people who had tried to victimize me was empowering in a way I hadn't expected. I might be 68 years old, but I was nobody's easy target. The story didn't end with the sentencing. Though, about 6 months after Michael went to prison, I received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Elena, who introduced herself as my daughter-in-law. At first, I thought she was confused or maybe calling the wrong number. Michael was married to Vivian, and as far as I knew, they would never divorce despite their legal troubles. Elena explained that she had been married to Michael 3 years earlier, in a ceremony in Las Vegas that had apparently never been legally dissolved. She had recently learned about Michael's second marriage through mutual friends, and was trying to sort out the legal implications. She lived in California and had been under the impression that Michael was going to divorce her and marry Vivian properly. But apparently, that had never happened. This meant that Michael's marriage to Vivian was invalid, which would complicate the legal and financial consequences of their crimes. It also meant that I had a daughter-in-law I would never met, and, as Elena explained during our phone conversation, a 4-year-old granddaughter named Sophia. Elena and I arranged to meet the following week when she drove to Arizona to visit. She was nothing like Vivian, warm, down to earth, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. She worked as a nurse at a children's hospital and was raising Sophia as a single mother because Michael had essentially abandoned them when he moved to Arizona. She would been too proud to pursue child support and had managed on her own. But she thought Sophia deserved to know her father's family. When Elena arrived at my apartment that Saturday morning, I was struck by how young she looked despite everything she had been through. She had the kind of tiredness around her eyes that comes from working long shifts and raising a child alone, but also a strength and determination that reminded me of myself at that age. Sophia was shy at first, hiding behind her mother's legs and peeking out at me with curious brown eyes that were unmistakably Michael's. I had prepared for their visit by buying some children's books and a few toys, not knowing what a 4-year-old might like. I would also baked cookies the night before. Chocolate chip, the same recipe I would used when Michael was young. The smell of those cookies baking had brought back so many memories of school afternoons and homework sessions and bedtime stories that I would had to sit down and collect myself. Elena told me their story while Sophia explored my apartment with the fearless curiosity of a preschooler. Michael and Elena had met in Las Vegas while he was there for a work conference, and she was visiting friends. It was one of those whirlwind romances that moved very quickly. They were married within 6 months of meeting, in a small ceremony at a chapel with just Elena's family in attendance. Michael had promised to bring Elena and their future children to meet me, but there always seemed to be reasons why the timing wasn't right. When Sophia was born, Elena had hoped that becoming a father would make Michael more committed to their family and more interested in putting down roots. Instead, he seemed to become more restless and distant. He started talking about opportunities in other cities, better jobs, chances to make more money faster. When Sophia was 2, he announced that he would found a position in Phoenix that was too good to pass up, and he promised to send for them once he was established. The phone calls became less frequent, the video chats with Sophia shorter and more hurried. When Elena tried to make plans to visit or discussed moving to Arizona herself, Michael always had excuses. The housing market was too expensive. His new job required too much travel. He wanted to save up more money before they made the move. Eventually, the calls stopped altogether, and Elena realized that he wasn't planning to send for them at all. She would try to protect Sophia from the disappointment of her father's abandonment, telling her that Daddy had to work far away, but that he loved her very much. When Sophia asked why they never saw him or talked to him, Elena would explain that grown-ups sometimes had to make difficult choices, and that it didn't mean anything was wrong with Sophia or that she wasn't loved. I could see how much it cost Elena to maintain that fiction. But I also understood why she felt it was necessary. Meeting Sophia was like getting a piece of my heart back that I didn't know was missing. She was bright, curious, and had Michael's eyes and smile from when he was young. But she also had Elena's warmth and openness. She called me Grandma Dot from the first day we met, and within an hour of arriving at my apartment, she was helping me water my plants and asking if she could have a sleepover sometime. I felt more love and joy in that one afternoon than I had experienced in the entire previous year. Sophia had never had grandparents actively involved in her life. Elena's parents lived across the country and had limited financial resources for travel, and of course she would never met anyone from Michael's side. She was fascinated by the photo albums I showed her, pointing to pictures of Michael as a child and asking if that was really her daddy when he was little. She wanted to know about his favorite foods, his favorite toys, whether he would like to color and play dress, up the way she did. I found myself sharing stories I hadn't thought about in years, how Michael used to build elaborate structures with blocks and then knock them down with toy cars, how he would insisted on wearing his Halloween costume to school for a week after the holiday, how he would once tried to give away his lunch to a classmate whose family couldn't afford school meals. These were the memories of the child I would loved unconditionally, before life and circumstances had changed him into someone I no longer recognized. Elena and Sophia started visiting regularly, and I began to build the family relationship I would always wanted. Elena appreciated having help with childcare and someone to talk to about the challenges of single parenthood. Sophia loved having a grandmother who had time to read her stories, help her with art projects, and teach her to bake cookies. I found purpose and happiness in being useful and needed in positive ways, rather than being seen as a source of money to be exploited. We also worked together to establish legal clarity around Sophia's relationship to Michael and her rights to support and inheritance. Elena wasn't interested in punishing Michael further or trying to extract money from him while he was in prison, but she wanted to ensure that Sophia's future was protected. I helped her navigate the legal system and even contributed to a small college fund for Sophia, money that I was able to invest safely now that I had revoked Michael's access to my accounts. The experience taught me that family isn't just about blood relationships or legal obligations. Elena and Sophia became more important to me than Michael had been in years, not because of guilt or duty, but because we genuinely cared about each other's well-being. We built trust slowly and honestly, without hidden agendas or financial manipulation. Elena never asked me for money or made me feel like I was being tolerated rather than loved. I also learned that standing up for myself had been the right choice, even though it had been painful and scary. If I had stayed silent about the financial abuse, Michael would have continued stealing from me until there was nothing left. Other elderly victims might have continued being exploited. The real estate fraud scheme would have continued operating, potentially destroying more families and communities. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that someone is your own child. Now, more than a year after that disastrous wedding day, I have built a new life that is richer and more authentic than what I had before. I spend time with Elena and Sophia several times a week. I have become more active in the senior center, helping other elderly people recognize and report financial abuse. I have learned to use technology more confidently so that I can protect myself better and stay connected with the people I care about. I still think about Michael sometimes, and I still feel sad about how our relationship ended, but I don't feel guilty about the choices I made. He was an adult who made decisions that hurt people, and he faced the consequences that any adult should face for those decisions. The fact that he was my son didn't give him the right to exploit my trust or steal my financial security. Love doesn't mean accepting abuse, even from family members. The wedding where I was treated like an unwelcome intruder turned out to be the beginning of my real education about who I could trust and who I couldn't. It taught me that respect has to be earned and maintained, that family relationships require honesty and reciprocity, and that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are actually the ones who understand you the least. But it also taught me that I was stronger, smarter, and more valuable than the people who tried to diminish me had ever realized. If I could go back and change what happened, I am not sure I would. The pain and betrayal were real, and I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. But the growth, the new relationships, and the self-respect I gained were also real, and they have made my life better in ways I never expected. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the thing that saves you from settling for less than you deserve. To anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation, being excluded, exploited, or taken for granted by family members, I want you to know that you have more power than you think. Age and vulnerability don't make you helpless. Trust your instincts, document everything, ask for help when you need it, and don't be afraid to fight for yourself. The people who truly love you will support your efforts to protect yourself. The ones who don't aren't really family anyway, no matter what their legal relationship to you might be. And remember that it is never too late to build new relationships, learn new skills, or stand up for what is right. I was 68 years old when I learned these lessons, but they have made my remaining years more fulfilling than I ever imagined they could be. Sometimes the best chapters of your life are the ones you write after you have stopped, letting other people hold the pen. I would love to hear your thoughts on this situation. Have you ever had to make difficult decisions about family relationships when trust was broken? How do you balance loyalty with self-protection? And what advice would you give to other people facing similar challenges? Please share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you would like to hear more stories about resilience, family dynamics, and finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are stronger than you know.